Welcome to my lecture on Hesiod's Poetic Theology. I might slip in to an old habit of calling him Hesiod. I think people call him either Hesiod or Hesiod. I'm going to try to stick with Hesiod for today. That seems to be the fashion these days. I won't judge you if you choose the alternate way. How many of you have ever read anything by Hesiod? Did you read the Theology?
No, I read
Works and Days. Awesome. Scott Hubbard gets the remainder of a cookie. No. I'm kidding. Well, how many of you have ever read the Percy Jackson series? More people in the room. Some of this material will seem mildly familiar, if not majorly familiar, because Hesiod is one of the first sources for us of the literature that sometimes gets called Greek mythology. Maybe some of you are surprised in Homer that you have a sort of constant focus on human events and mythological realities, theological realities, by which I mean the things pertaining to the gods. They're referenced obliquely or subtly, but they're not the subject or material of this story. Well, not so in Hesiod, especially in his poem called Theology that I'll focus on in this talk. All right, but what did Hesiod, we'll go back to those. What did Hesiod write? This actually is a papyrus fragment of a piece that sometimes people credit to Hesiod's authorship. He is credited certainly with the authorship of a poem called Works and Days. This poem was agrarian. That means it has to do with sort of the life of agriculture, rural, shepherd, farming, etc. It has things about how to build your plow and when your sheep, when your sheep are going to be the fattest and when the wine will be the purest. It has stuff about the seasons and about good civic duty. It's proverbial, meaning it sounds a lot like the kind of tradition from which even the Proverbs, the book in the scriptures, is an exemplar of. Later, so this Works and Days poem that we won't really focus on, later it became an inspiration for some of the poets who loved Hesiod the best. In the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, there's a whole school called the Alexandrian poets. They're in Alexandria, which is in Egypt, and they're literate, educated. They're collecting all of these ancient works after Greece has fallen politically. Anyway, they love him, and they start imitating him, and they write all sorts of poems also about cattle rearing and grain growing. Virgil, whom you will read, or some of you have read, eventually, through the school of the Alexandrian poets, his first major work called the Eclogues is an imitation of Hesiod's Works and Days. He there writes about things like farming and cattle raising. Anyway, additionally, Hesiod wrote, and this is the one we're talking about today, the Theogony, which is about the birth or genealogy. You can hear that G-N, generation. That's all embedded in the word theogony in the second part of the word. And theo is just from theos, which means God. So it's the birth of the gods. And in this, we'll talk a lot about this tonight, but in this, Hesiod undertakes to tell the story of the beginning of things and the generations of the gods that follow. He is often credited with a poem called The Shield of Heracles, though contemporary scholars suspect that that was not his. That's about Hercules and his exploits. He is sometimes credited with that papyrus fragment that I just showed you, with a poem called The Catalogue of Women. And at the end of the Theogony, Hesiod starts talking about women, the women who are having babies, heroes. They're the age of heroes, birthed by mothers. And he starts talking about that by saying, like her who, or like her who. He's trying to list women, and what remains at the end of manuscripts of the Theogony is this etoiai, whatever that, this Greek construction, which means something like those who, like her who. Anyway, it's a catalog of women that we only have fragments of. Similarly, the divination of birds, we only have fragments of, and other writers like Aristotle and Plutarch and Callimachus, they all refer to Hesiod's wisdom about the divination of birds. Now, a poet who on the one hand wants to say, hard work is necessary. This world is hard to live in, so you have to learn how to be a good farmer and practice justice to your neighbor. You got to be wise, because this world has some real miseries, and there are some rewards for wisdom. That's all works and days stuff. And then he says, you know what's behind all that? The gods and all their crazy baby having. Not surprising to think that maybe a poem that was about how the gods might send you signs by the birds, he might be someone who would tell you about the gods sending signs by the birds, the art of augury or divination. All right, those are some of Hesiod's works. The ones we have in complete possession are Works and Days and Theogony, and there's enough of the Shield of Heracles to read it as a bit of a hero narrative. All right, backwards, and then we'll go right back through these. Here is a sculpture of a man who was probably the poet Hesiod. We can't know because he did not put his own photo up on his Facebook page, so we don't know what he looked like. But there he is. How do we know about Hesiod's life? Well, mostly because of this accidental autobiographical data that he puts in his own poems. So, in the two major poems, we get a number of details about his life. In some senses, we know more facts, or presumed facts, about Hesiod than we do about Homer, whose birthplace is guessed at, and only tradition tells us about anything in his life. But Hesiod's telling us things about himself. He tells us that he resides in Askra, in Boeotia. This is on the continent, on the mainland of Greece. And he says Askra is bad in the winter, pretty bad in the summer, not really good any time of year. And he's talking a lot about the agricultural life at that point. His father, he says, because at one point in this poem he writes Works and Days, he's talking about seafaring. And he says, well, my father, he was a seafaring tradesman, and he was from the region of Aeolus, and he came and moved here. So presumably from poverty, his father moved their family, maybe when Hesiod was already born, maybe before that. They moved to Askra. We know he was a shepherd and had an agrarian life, and not the sort that usually has privilege with it. It seems like he worked the land, and he tells the story, this third detail, he tells the story that he's out on Mount Helicon shepherding his sheep when the Muses appeared to him. So we know that he was an active agrarian. He had this major disagreement with his brother, which prompts his writing of the piece Works and Days. His brother's name is Perses, and he dedicates the poem to Perses and addresses him throughout the whole time. What it seems was the problem was their father died, divides the land, but Perses kind of tricks Hesiod, gets the better part of the land, and then has continued to try to encroach upon Hesiod's inheritance. So this whole poem is a lot about telling Perses, buddy, bro, work hard, life's hard, and you're trying to get the easy way out, and you need to just work and stop trying to steal my land. In this poem to Perses, we find out about that disagreement, and a little bit, maybe about practices of inheritance, etc. He also tells, backwards to the part where he is saying his father was a seafaring man, he's saying, I don't really like going on boats, but that one time I did go on a boat because I needed to go to that poetic competition, which I won. And it's at the poetic competition, and he says it's in honor of a figure named Amphidamus, and it's at that poetic competition, or from that we date his life, and that's where people think probably he's writing around 700 BC. So that's your best attempt to date Hesiod. Homer, so there's a long debate about whether Homer or Hesiod is older. And in fact, in the Alexandrian school that I referred to, sort of 400 years after Homer's and Hesiod's poetry, there's a story they begin to tell, even in a poetic form. They tell this story that it's Homer and Hesiod that are at this poetic competition, and they both present their poems, and everyone agrees that Homer's craft is superior by far, but Homer's talking about war, and Hesiod, whose craft is inferior, he's a peacetime poet. So they grant the prize to Hesiod, the inferior poet whose subject matter is preferable. This is super unlikely. It's a nice fiction. Similarly, a nice fiction, Hesiod's death is shrouded in mystery. And the mysteries include the cause of his death, which might have been his punishment when he visited a village and they accused him of sexual crimes against some of the daughters of the household he's at, and they tore his body in pieces and dolphins ate him. So there's that story. There are ways that we get historical rootings. We get some ground for understanding that Hesiod did in fact die, in case we were concerned that wasn't true. Thucydides, whom you Morgan House freshmen will read or have read, but we'll be discussing this next week or so. He has this moment, he's just talking about where this army camps in the middle of a battle, and he tells about how the army camped in the sanctuary of Nemean Zeus, where Hesiod is said to have died at the hands of the local people after he had received an oracle that he would die in Nemea. So the story goes something like, oh, Hesiod had heard an oracle on his way home from his competition. He stopped at Delphi, he got a nice oracle, finds out how he's gonna die, he tries to avoid it, and unfortunately, when the oracle had said Nemea, he thought of a land named Nemea, but in fact it was this site sacred to Zeus, something like this. That's one of the stories. Notice how in that you've got the constant wrestling that the Greeks are doing with the futility of oracular knowledge, right? They're just constantly trapped by these things that are spoken of what will be, and you do everything you can to avoid it, and you're still going to fulfill the word spoken against you. Anyway, we'll leave alone the he may have lived again and died again. That's part of the story. All right. To the Theogony. The first scene in the Theogony is the scene where the Muses come and visit Hesiod on Mount Helicon, the Heliconian Muses, who are the daughters of Zeus, mistresses of words. And they speak to Hesiod, and they address him as a shepherd, talking about how shepherds of the wilderness are poor fools because they only listen to their bellies. But they're offering their gifts to him. They say, we know how to say many false things that seem like true sayings, but we also know how to speak the truth when we wish to. And he becomes enthralled. He's in their service. They're these beautiful 9 sisters who enjoy the mountainside and bathe and walk barefoot and sing songs, lovely, live, etc. They hand him a staff, which is in the Greek culture, it seems, staffs are always some sign of authority or office. So they hand him a staff, though this is the first time that you hear a poet receiving a staff. Because, again, Hesiod is our first poet of this sort. Homer and Hesiod as sort of maybe contemporaries. Maybe Hesiod is downstream from him, but still, Hesiod's referring to himself as a poet, and Homer never does. So you never hear Homer saying, and I received a laurel, and the muses visited me, though you do hear Homer saying, sing, muse, of the rage of Achilles, Peleus' son. Well, Hesiod tells the story of they appointed me poet, and they gave me the power to sing the story of things future and things past. And they told me to sing the race of the blessed gods everlasting. So they gave him the subject of his poem, Theology. And they said to always put themselves at the beginning and the end of his singing. And so this, what we call, in literary tradition, we call it the invocation of the muse, when a poet calls upon the muse. Hesiod saying, I call upon the muses because they told me to. And I'm obeying them. Let me read to you what he ends up saying about his calling as poet. And here's the fun of this little lecture. You'll get to hear some Hesiod. Maybe that will tempt you to read the whole thing. Maybe it will be just a nice gift to you. So he says, such is the gift the muses give to humanity. So it is from the muses and from Apollo of the far cast that there are men on earth who are poets and players on the lyre. The lords are from Zeus, so that he's saying people who have official status, government, the lords of men, they're from Zeus. But blessed is that one whom the muses love, for the voice of his mouth runs and is sweet. And even when a man has sorrow fresh in the troublement of his spirit and is struck to wonder over the grief in his heart, the singer, the servant of the muses, singing the glories of ancient men and blessed gods who have their homes on Olympus, makes him presently forget his cares. He no longer remembers sorrow, for the gifts of the goddesses soon turn his thoughts elsewhere. So Hesiod, who is constantly acknowledging the woes of the world and how sorrowful it is, he says it's in singing, it's in forming the song that the poet somehow receives blessedness, the blessedness of some kind of forgetfulness, some kind of cure for his weariness for a time, which makes, the sense that it makes immediately is that if songs are indeed beautiful, if art somehow creates beauty, then to sing, even to sing of sorrow, is to somehow elevate the experience and to be in some ways recovered by way of beauty. The muses, here's what's worth acknowledging from this. Hesiod can't know the things he's talking about by himself. He wasn't there in the beginning. He hasn't met Uranus or Gaia or Apollo or Zeus, right? He can't know even the heroes' lives. The muses are telling him the story he tells. So this is what it means, in part, for a poet to derive poetic authority or credibility from an appeal to the muses. He's saying, I've been given this story. That's how I know it. I know it because, and this is worth knowing, the muses are the daughters of Zeus and a goddess named Mnemosyne, which is the word for memory. Mnemonic devices, remember that? Anamnesis, amnesia, these are all memory-related words. Mnemosyne is their mother and Zeus their father. Since Zeus is their father, their poetry is Zeus-centered. And if you read the Theogony with a critical eye, with a wary eye, you'll feel sometimes where Hesiod seems to, I'd say, register ambivalence about the reign of Zeus. But not the muses. The muses seek to please Father Zeus and to orient people towards his praise. And Hesiod's clear about that. This is Zeus-oriented, Zeus-centered. Also, hold in mind two more things about what the muses reveal about poetry. One is they say, hey, you shepherds, you fools, you're always stuck in your bellies. But I could teach you poetry. And so there's a way that poetry presumably elevates the human creature, even if the human creature is going to sing about things like shepherding. crafting song. And you'll notice I'm going back and forth between saying poetry and song, and this is because they were so closely aligned for the Greeks. Singing was the normal mode of poetry. It was song-ish. Anyway, it elevates people from their bellies, presumably. Also notice that the muses say, we know how to sing things as if they were true, and we know how to sing true things. So there's a real ambiguity, even in their own announcement, of what their skills are. We'll tell you things, they'll sound true, sometimes they will be. And that's as much as we get in terms of security. A quick list, so when Hesiod names the 9, 9s and 10s are important, and 3s are super important. Sometimes I get interested in numeric significances. This time I can just alert you to the fact that those were the important numbers to him, and I'm not sure why right now. All right, but you'll see the names here. If any of you have ever read, like Robert Graves or Edith Hamilton, they're both good reference books for mythology. You'll often hear in the tradition how each of these muses has become the muse of a certain kind of poetry or art. But it seems that for Hesiod, he's naming aspects of poetry, at least, or they're named because they represent aspects of poetry. And he doesn't yet think Calliope, she's the muse of epic poetry. But that becomes a tradition in the ancient world, is to think Calliope is the muse of epic poetry, and Clio is the muse of history, because she is preoccupied with the fame of men, etc. So if you've ever heard people talk about the muse of a certain art, it's not in Hesiod, but it does seem to be an extension of his thought. A quick advertisement forward, Urania becomes the favorite muse of the early modern, the Renaissance poets. Uranos means heaven, and you'll see him as an actual figure in the mythology that we'll be going through, in the stories we'll be telling. But Urania means heavenly. And so eventually, when Milton is singing the song of the fall of Adam and Eve and the fall of the rebel angels and God's divine providence through all of this story in Paradise Lost, he has 4 different invocations of the muse, and by, I think it's book 7, he names his muse Urania, and he is identifying his muse with the heavenly spirit. Literally, the heavenly spirit who breathed into Moses the stories of Adam and Eve at first, and gave to the people of God the words of God. Milton's a little daring, let's be honest. But all that to say, Urania is later received as Christian poets try to think through the tradition. They think, oh, I suppose if there's a heavenly spirit that gives us insight, that heavenly spirit would be the one who's inspiring the scriptures. What seems really strange about Milton's move is to suspect that he could be inspired by that same spirit just by petition. That's the strange part, and who knows whether he did that as convention or sincerely. I want his diary so that I can know what he meant, but I don't have it. So anyway, it's not entirely off to be thinking in that way, though you can hear how strange it is to think in that way. All right. Well, to the Theogony, let me read to you. So after the muses come, then Hesiod starts to tell what his subject is going to be. All right, so he says, "Hail then, children of Zeus, grant me lovely singing, Now sound out the holy stock of the everlasting immortals who came into being out of Gaia and starry Uranos and gloomy night, whom Pontos, the salt sea, brought to maturity, and tell how at the first the gods and the earth were begotten, and rivers and the boundless sea raging in its swell, the blazing stars and the wide sky above all. Tell of the gods, bestowers of blessings, who were begotten of all these, and how they divided their riches and distributed their privileges, and how they first took possession of many-folded Olympus. Tell me all this, you muses, you who have your homes on Olympus, from the beginning, and tell who was first to come forth among them. All right, this chart, this family tree, you can't see. I just found it on the internet. I'm gonna give props to the makers, Carlos Parada and Malcor Forlag, and I'm gonna move on because here's the story. That's how crazy the theogony is. It's that sprawling, it's that monstrous, it's that generative. What I want you to see in this is that you're not looking for a masterable chart. You're not just thinking, awesome, I want to memorize who had whom, and that's great. No, these people are hopping into one another's. They don't have beds, but, and they're also generating from themselves. Like, they're just popping out offspring, and that offspring has like hundreds of arms and 10 heads, and. So, we're not actually going to comprehend the whole. At one point, Hesiod actually lists the 50 names of the Nereids, the sea daughters, which is awesome. I'm not going to read it to you. But let's go to some of the key moments, some of the, I think, most, giving ones. Here, in the beginning, right after that list, we find out what Hesiod is saying is at the beginning of all. Now, I've actually gone back and forth in my account of what's in the beginning. There are either 3 or 4 things in the beginning, 4 beings or 3 beings. I settled on the 3. Chaos is given no explanation. He doesn't add anything to. In the beginning, there is chaos and Gaia, and then he says much about Gaia. Gaia of the broad breast to be the unshakable foundation of all the immortals who keep the crests of snowy Olympus, and Tartarus, the foggy in the pit of the wide-wayed earth. Does anyone know the English translation for the word Gaia, for the name Gaia? Earth, yes. So Gaia, now, and then Eros, and Eros, who is love, handsomest among all the immortals. Now, couple things to highlight here. I'll tell you who I think the 4th might be in this account. That wasn't meant to be a Plato joke, but it might be. It really might be, right? You go to a creation myth, and where is the 4th becomes the big opener. Well, the only question here is Tartarus another figure at the beginning? And Tartarus, in fact, is not just a place. By the end of the poem, Gaia has mated with Tartarus too, because she falls in love with him. So Tartarus is both place and person by the end of the poem, just like Gaia is place and person. But it also seems like you could read this part, Gaia, she keeps the crests of snowy Olympus. They're the uppermost limits of her very body, as it were, of the Earth's body. Snowy Olympus, those are the highest mountains reaching into the sky. And then Tartarus, those are the total depths under the Earth. There's a kind of endless chasm that's under the Earth. So you could think of Gaia as being snowy reaches of Olympus and Tartarus. So anyway, you can see how that's ambiguous. And scholars disagree. So I settled right now on 3, but for the majority of my prep, I was thinking, Tartarus, I think, is there at the beginning. Chaos is less suggestive of disorganization, just to be clear, as chasm, space that's empty. Chaos, chasm is a good word to associate. Now, in later accounts of the gods, Eros is the name for the little boy that accompanies Aphrodite as her son, this little boy Cupid, who's sometimes more like a teenager and every once in a while a man. This is not Cupid Eros. This is worth highlighting. Eros here, he never shows up again as a person, so he has no offspring himself. Eros seems to be the divine being who, presiding at the beginning, seems to incentivize all of the generation that then proceeds. Does that make sense? So erotic love, of course, is sometimes generative. And Eros here stands in the beginning as a primal reality, as a first reality. It's worth noting, Eros never shows up in Homer. So here's a moment where you can really register difference in these contemporary poets. Eros doesn't show up as a god striding into battle. He's not a big part of Homer's cosmogony, his way of conceiving of the cosmos. Aphrodite figures more strongly, and we'll talk about Hesiod's account of the birth of Aphrodite in a little bit. It's awesome. All right, so Chaos, Gaia, Eros, maybe Tartarus, which you'll hear more about the distinction between Tartarus and Hades. Tartarus is not just hell. Tartarus is abysmal space. It becomes the place where the gods are sent, and Hades is just under the ground for the spirits of men, something like that. So Tartarus, Chaos, then Gaia, and Eros. You can kind of feel out for yourself if you think there are values to these first figures. All right, Chaos, just so you know, does have his own progeny. He births Erebos, which is dark, and Nux, which is night. Those are his first. His offspring, breed together Ether and Day. Ether is meant to be some sort of air that's above the air we breathe. It's brighter, lighter air, a sort of circumference to the sky. And day, so night and dark have their offspring as day, which means day is contingent upon, I think, night and dark. Night, then, just so you can also hear the kinds of things that are generally coming from night, bears the ends of things, sleep, death, dreams. And Hesiod says, she bears those by herself, no god had loved her. Somehow, I don't know, it's a sweet little moment where we care about night. She bears the Hesperides, which they are these lovely women who live at the uttermost, the world's edges. In fact, Hesiod calls them the gloomy ends of the earth, where there are these golden apples that somehow become a taunt for human creatures. So the Hesperides are residents of the gardens, eventually, where these golden apples grow at the gloomy ends of the earth that sort of tease you. And they're guarded by a deadly snake. She also bears the Fates. There are three, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. Now, here's what's strange, I think. In the first account, right here early on in the poem, night bears the Fates. But later, once Zeus comes into his reign and rule, he also gives birth to the Fates. One of the only sets where there's a dual account of the generation. We could think about what that suggests. It does seem like an account that is Zeus's attempt to reign over all, to even give birth to the Fates. But it also means you have these two possibilities. And this comes up a lot in Greek theology, in the accounts of the gods. There are differing accounts of where things came from, and poets are competing for authoritative versions. But what that means is either you get people who are prone to reconciling, and then they say, there are two types of fates. In fact, Hesiod does this himself in the beginning of Works and Days. He says there are two types of strife. There's the kind of strife that's just hellish, and then there's the strife who encourages us to work for our good. You could do something like that in trying to understand two accounts of the fates. Or you could think of something, that this reveals something about Zeus himself and his rule and reign. It's a confusion that ends up being, I think, somewhat meaningful. Okay, all right. Then we get to talk about the descendants of Gaia, an image that is presumably of Gaia. All right, Gaia, the firstborn from herself is Uranos. So again, she, without partner, breeds Uranos, the starry sky, to cover her all over, to be an unshakable standing place for the blessed immortals. Uranos, I already think I said this earlier, what does Uranos mean in English? Heaven. So, earth and heaven. Earth gives birth to heaven, and heaven then becomes her partner, and they start bringing to life mountains and nymphs and bodies of water and rivers that girt her wide hips, and et cetera, et cetera. All right. And then Uranos, he doesn't like the children that Gaia starts bearing. And he wants to, Kronos is one of these children that she starts to bear. And so he starts to always push the children back into her. And she, of course, doesn't love this. And so she's talking to her children, and she asks, which of them might be willing to help. Devious devising Kronos, the most terrible of her children, he hated his strong father. Okay, here's a moment where we have to think about the ways that Hesiod is forming the story. He is always speaking from the present. That's a fun thing about Hesiod. Whereas in an epic poem, there will be moments where the future is referred to, and for the reader it's totally the past. But in the poem, you're speaking from the moment of action in the poem. Hesiod's not. Hesiod's always speaking from the moment of the living of the reader or audience. So the reader and audience already knows, Kronos, he's banished. Kronos becomes a bad guy in this story. So even when he's born, Hesiod calls him devious devising Kronos, the most terrible of children. He hates his strong father. But while the story's unfolding, we find out Uranos is a pretty terrible dad. He hates his own children, thereby hating his wife. And his wife asks, hey, somebody help me. So Kronos at this moment in the story is appearing a hero, though later he becomes a villain. All right? Well, here's a fun part of the story, I think. So Kronos is given a sickle. I don't know, do you know what a sickle is? I think I do. It's a sharp thing. It needed to be, because when Uranos comes upon Gaia at night, Kronos takes the sickle, he cuts off Uranos' members, and he throws them far away into the sea. Now, from this castration, blood from Uranos starts to fall into Gaia. That blood eventually births the Furies. You guys just read about an Aeschylus. Oh yeah, the Furies and some giants too, with spears. So the origin of the Furies, I'm getting some serious reactions over here. Okay, so the Furies then are born out of a kind of crime against a vicious father. But the kind of retribution is, of course, enormous. The vicious father deserves some kind of punishment, but the punishment he receives is severe. So anyway, you can think, okay, so the Furies are somehow born of this kind of conflict, a nearly unresolvable conflict where the punishment includes dismembering. Second little detail, so Kronos' members, no, not Kronos', Uranos' members are thrown into the sea. From that sea is birthed Aphrodite. Yeah, that's it, that's the story. Aphrodite, the goddess of all beauty and loveliness, but also, you know, little tricksy lady that she is born there in the ocean where Uranos' genitals fell. So this is a perfect lecture for video. All right. Rise of Kronos. He wins, by the way, right? So he's like, his father is mad, but I mean, like, lost all his power. And Kronos is sort of elevated to basically have the rule for the time. We'll talk more about that. You've got the birth of the Furies, you've got the birth of Aphrodite. And now there's a new age of man. Now, a quick aside or addendum. In Works and Days, Hesiod is mostly talking about the life of man right now and not much about the life of the gods. But he wants to explain how it is that we had this history where all was well, and now we don't. So he says, there was a golden age. There was this time where everyone was happy and blessed, and the earth gave forth its fruit, and no one had to work, and there was peace and concord, and death was asleep, and it was all beautiful and good. And then what happened? Well, Kronos cut Uranos off, and we started another age. And then what happened? Well, Zeus took over, and we started another age. So he has the story of the ages of man, and he tells of 5. He says there was the golden age, the silver age, the bronze age, when everyone is just at terrible battle, the iron age. Maybe he only has 4. Because Ovid brings in the stone age. Don't quote me on that. I think there are 5, and I'm only remembering 4 right now. Gold, silver, bronze, iron. Anyway, I think there's something else. All right, the myth of ages. Now, it's another way of telling a story. And it actually, even in Works and Days, he had said, hey, why are we so miserable? It's because of Prometheus and how Zeus is punishing us because Prometheus stole fire. Or let me tell you a different way. It's because there was that golden age and then Kronos. So notice how these alternative explanations, they're not necessarily exclusive, but they are quite alternative to one another. Okay. Notice, please, I'm sure you already have, there's this problematic patria. Family life in the heavens is undesirable, okay? So as soon as you start to see any kind of discourse on what family might be, it's over against, for the Greeks, it's over against a problematic patria that precedes Zeus's fatherhood of all. They want to vindicate Zeus as father of all, but they know that first fathers have been terrible. And there's a ton, I mean, really, there's lots of incest, there's lots of opposition between children and fathers, the victimization in large degree, and then sometimes the total plotting and treachery of the mothers. This is what kind of lurks behind the story of the heavens. Here's a moment. I'm going to tell you my favorite. Is someone asking a question? Am I missing it? No. Okay. I think I can. Can I do that now or come back to it? I'll come back to it. I'll come back to one of my favorite moments because it's kind of an aside, but it's like my favorite thing that I found this read. All right, let's talk about Zeus. So Kronos reigns. He beds Rhea, who's his sister wife. She bears some goddesses you might, they might sound familiar. Demeter, who eventually becomes goddess of the harvest. Hera, who is Zeus's consort eventually. Hades, and again, I'll remind you, Hades lives under the ground in his palace, but not in Tartarus. It's a different region. And then Zeus. She also bears Zeus to Kronos. Kronos, who has opposed his father for opposing his children, heard from Gaia and Uranos that he was going to have a son that was going to overthrow him, and he didn't like that, so he decides he's going to swallow his children. So Kronos, so if you thought, oh, I knew that story a little bit, but I thought it was Zeus's father. Oh, it was. It was Zeus's father and his father before him. So Kronos is swallowing his children that Rhea births. As they're at her knees, the poem says, he swallows them. So Gaia and Uranos decide to help Rhea with a plan. They're still around. They're helpful parents. Finally, you see a little redemptive moment in the family history. And so they're like, we'll help you. We know how bad things can get. So they preserve Zeus. Gaia hides Zeus in a cave, and gives Kronos a rock. You've probably heard this part, to swallow. Feeds him a rock, because he's been swallowing his babies, so she wraps a rock in swaddling clothes and places it in Kronos' mouth. And Zeus eventually gets to grow up. There's enough time for him to grow. I don't know how long it takes gods to grow, so that's okay. He grows up, and at the same time, Gaia gets Kronos to vomit up the rock, and maybe the other siblings. Zeus places this rock at Pytho, where it's a monument, and it was a monument at this time. So partly, again, Hesiod is from the present saying, you know that rock? This is the story behind that rock. I'm telling it now. It's been told too, but he's telling it in his poem. So Zeus then frees these enchained titans, siblings of Kronos. Kronos didn't like any threat to his power, so he had chained up a number of his siblings. So obviously he wasn't opposed to people being locked up. He just was opposed to himself being stuck in his mother's womb or something like that. So he's chained up his own siblings. Now Zeus, clever Zeus, and he is called Zeus of the councils, Zeus of the wise councils. He's always plotting. He's full of good strategies. Well, here's his first good strategy. He goes and he frees the enchained titans. And so in gratitude, they serve him as Lord. They're like, awesome, we'll totally rally behind you because you're our deliverer. Now, then Zeus has enough of a following. They give him lightning because he's been that awesome. So they're like, you're our Lord, you need weapons, here's some lightning. So he becomes a kind of sky god. All right, that's how Zeus comes into his early regime. But the story is not totally through. He's lightning-wielding Zeus of the councils. He's already called the father of gods and men from the first. And this is a moment where Hesiod's naming, the epithets he uses, are especially, I think, ironic, right? So we've been hearing all about the births of all of these gods. We know who their fathers are. But Hesiod says, Zeus, father of gods and men. Zeus, father of all gods and all men. He's just insisting that it's Zeus's fatherhood that marks the current age. We'll hear how Zeus becomes father to many in just a little while. There's a lot of fighting between the generation of Zeus and his siblings, and then the people that he has attracted to his service, and the Titans. So Kronos is not totally disempowered yet, right? So they're all fighting for a long time, for 10 years. Again, the number 10 is significant, so 9 is significant because 9 is close to 10. So for 10 years, they're fighting. This is called, I'm going to tell you about this and maybe not Prometheus. Okay, so there are 2 major threats registered in Hesiod, and Hesiod tells the story of Zeus resolving the 2 major threats to his power that he's telling about. And so the first is Kronos and his cadre. They keep fighting with the generation of Olympians, we can call them. Zeus and his are mostly the Olympians because they eventually get to reside on Olympus. They take their residence there. And the Titans are this older age. But notice some of the Titans, some of the generation of Kronos are on Zeus's side, so it's a little bit of a compounding label. Anyway, they have this fight that's going on and on and on, And Zeus, again, strategic deliverer, goes to these three gods that were Uranos's offspring. So they're Kronos' siblings. And I think Uranos hated them and locked them up. And so he goes, and they're mighty, and they're great, and they're strong. So he frees them, and he feeds them nectar and ambrosia they need to recover. They've been, in prison for a long time. And then, eventually, he unleashes their power. And that war is utterly cataclysmic. I'll go ahead and read to you a section on what's called the Titanomachia when you hear it referred to. It becomes a significant source, by the way, for Milton when he writes about the war in heaven, the presumable fall of Lucifer and the angels that he brings with him. You can hear Hesiod is in the background of telling that story by a lot, this war in heaven. All right, to line 687. You can just hear some of the drama. This is one of the only moments of serious action in this poem. So these three gods are out and about now, and Zeus no longer holds in his strength, but here his heart filled deep with fury, and now he showed his violence entire and indiscriminately. Out of the sky and off Olympus he moved, flashing his fires incessantly, and the thunderbolts, the crashing of them and the blaze together came flying one after another from his ponderous hand, and spinning whirls of inhuman flame, and with it the earth, the giver of life, cried out aloud as she burned, and the vast forests in the fire screamed. All earth was boiling with it, and the courses of the ocean and the barren sea, and the steam of the heat of it was engulfing the Titans of the earth, while the flames went up to the bright sky unquenchably, and the blaze and the glare of thunder and lightning blinded the eyes of the Titan gods, for all they were mighty. Anyway, as a moment, and then the later moment, finally, the three, Cottos, Briareos, and Gaius, insatiate of battle, stirred the grim fighting in the foremost, for from their powerful hands they volleyed 300 boulders one after another, and their missile flights overwhelmed the Titans in darkness, and these they drove underneath the wide-wayed earth and fastened them there in painful bondage, for now they had beaten the Titan gods with their hands for all their high hearts. They drove them as far underground as earth is distant from heaven. Such is the distance from earth's surface to gloomy Tartarus. For a brazen anvil dropping out of the sky would take 9 nights and 9 days and land on the earth on the 10th day. And a brazen anvil dropping off the earth would take 9 nights and 9 days and land on Tartarus on the 10th day. And then we actually get a long explanation of the abyss of Tartarus and how at the bottom of all things there is a chasm that never ends, that is so deep, and its horrors are dark and dismal, and those are bound there. This in Hesiod. The other enemy to Zeus's plans tends to be this figure called Prometheus. And he is the son of a brother of Cronos, Iapetus. So and Prometheus does a number of trickster things. He tricks Zeus into taking a portion of sacrifice that Zeus didn't want. And he also steals fire from the heavens. So in fact, in Theology, because he tricked Zeus into taking a portion of the sacrifices that Zeus didn't actually prefer, he wanted the meaty portions, he wanted the good stuff, but he got tricked into taking the bones. And so there's that problem, so he gets mad at men. Kind of a bummer. It's kind of a bummer how much Zeus punishes men for what's happening in the heavens, but that's a consistent theme of Hesiod. So Zeus is doing that, and so Zeus refuses to give fire to the humans because that would make their lives easier. So Prometheus steals it. He gives it to the humans. This, of course, makes Zeus mad. Both times, in both works and days, so it's a story that Hesiod repeats. And in both stories, the way that Zeus visits evil upon the human creature after he has withheld fire from them is by giving them women. So this is really a true not a true thing, this is really truly how Hesiod presents the story, is that Zeus then gives Pandora, and she has all gifts. That's what pan means, all. Dora is gift. So she's got all these gifts. All the goddesses and gods give her all sorts of crafts and skills and beauty. So she's going to be totally alluring, right? Everyone's going to desire her. She's given in one of the accounts to Prometheus's brother Epimetheus. Pro means for. So Prometheus has all this forethought. He's savvy. He's thinking ahead. He's got games and strategies. He's almost a match for Zeus, and that's why they have such a rivalry. Epimetheus is afterthought. So unfortunately, though Prometheus had advised Epimetheus never to accept a gift from the gods, no matter how good it looked, Epimetheus sees Pandora and he's like, come to me, I'll take you. And she has been somehow instructed to release upon all the human creatures, all these evils. We've heard it called Pandora's box. In the poem, it's a jar. And an ambiguity that remains because the hope doesn't get out of the jar. That's a piece of the story we've probably heard. It's unclear whether or not hope is an evil. The jar is full of evils. If hope is an evil that just doesn't get out, it is because hope is delusional. It's because there's actually there's no kind of real good to hoping. All it does is fake you out into more and more dismal situations. Or, as many have interpreted the story, hope is not the evil. Hope is our resistance, our strength in the host of sorrow and suffering. And so she's mean, once again, when she shuts the jar just before hope flies out. Does that make sense? Either way, you're finding out how mean Pandora is.
I thought she was tricked.
Not in Hesiod's version. What trick had you heard?
That she was given the box and told not to open it because of woman's curiosity. She had to.
Oh, yeah. No, yeah, so that's not in Hesiod. In Hesiod, she just opens it because she's sent as an evil. So it's sufficient. She doesn't even have to be tricked. All right. Now, the end of the poem, after Zeus has shown that he can basically handle Prometheus, he punishes him pretty seriously. Aeschylus writes a drama called Prometheus Bound. It's lovely. It's worth reading. After the Prometheus story gets resolved, then the poem shows, so the war against the Titans is won, Prometheus is contained, and then Zeus becomes Basileus. He becomes king. And you guys who've read your Sophocles, Oedipus is called, in the title of the poem, he's called Oedipus Tyrannus. There are multiple words for king. Tyrant is one of them, and it didn't used to be pejorative in its significance. All it means is you're king not by heredity, but you're king by some other means. Oedipus was king because he had delivered the people. But eventually in the poem, when his identity is more and more revealed, for any of you that's a spoiler alert, I'm sorry. He then is called Basileus. Oh, Basileus, you are our king, but you're our king by heredity. So Sophocles there is listening in on this significant use of the word, in which to be Basileus means your dad's out of the picture, right? You've somehow killed your father. Hamlet is in agony over whether or not he could ever be Hamlet the king, because to do so involves the death of his father, not that he's responsible for it. Anyway, you can hear even in that little detail a way that, that the rest of the poets start to manage to interact with, engage with Hesiod. All right, the way he finishes out the poem, after Zeus is crowned king, Zeus starts peopling the heavens. His progeny, now here's the quirky bit. The first thing that Hesiod mentions is Zeus mates with a goddess called Metis, But he doesn't want her to have her baby because he heard that her baby was going to overthrow him or be wiser than him or something like that. So he eats her baby. In different versions of the story, it goes differently. But here, he swallows the child. And that child eventually is birthed from his head, and it's Athena. And so Athena becomes his progeny and is no longer a threat because it's not Medus's progeny, because Zeus consumed her and then birthed her. That's the way the story goes in Hesiod. Okay, now one detail there to pay attention to is Zeus has not quite escaped the curse of the fathers, right? He's still laboring under the same anxiety of being overthrown. And as Homer even teases out his relationship with the humans, the question of whether or not the glory of man is going to eclipse the glory of Zeus is something that Zeus is all about making sure that's not going to be the case. Anyway, Athena is born from Zeus, and then you get tons. You get so many lists of gods and goddesses that he starts to bear, so that he is becoming literally the father of gods. And then he becomes literally the father of men because Hesiod starts to catalog when he starts to breed demigods with human women, and then starts to catalog the Age of Heroes where the goddesses are sleeping with human men and having babies. And a quick detail that's kind of fun, in Hesiod, Odysseus has babies both with Calypso and Circe. So that's a little detail to show you that in the tradition, the sort of, as much as you really want to rail against Odysseus for staying too long with the goddesses, he's not as bad in Homer as he is in Hesiod. So Hesiod starts ending the story, again, with the Age of Heroes. And it's from the heroes that somehow we all descend, right? These are the early human creatures, the families of the earth have all of these demigods in them, and we are generations downstream from them, but our story starts to connect in hints and guesses. That's where Hesiod leaves the reader. But Ovid, when he gets a hold of this kind of thing in the Metamorphoses, instead of stopping at the Age of Heroes and thinking about the Age of Man, he gets to the point where he says, and then men start to become gods. And so he tells the story all the way into men being received into heaven as divinized creatures themselves. I want to tell you two things more. One is that while I kept calling this occasionally mythology, that's a slip, that's a concession to a sort of constant norm in conversation. I actually want to say this is poetry, and it's a little different than mythology in the way that we normally conceive it. And the word myth becomes really meaningful in relation to these accounts when Plato starts, well, Socrates probably, but Plato starts recording the Socratic argument with the poets. There are some pre-Socratic philosophers who also sometimes argue with the poets, but Socrates really takes it head on. Muthos, the word from which we get myth, it's a word for word. Muthos, it's a word, it's an account, it's a saying. Logos is another word for word. But what Plato starts pushing is that we need to distinguish between muthoi and logoi, words that are, eventually he says, likely stories, and words that are logoi, that have rational principle in them. Now, you'll notice as you read through your Plato, Plato doesn't think we always get to arrive at logoi, right? He wants it, and he says some of the stories that Hesiod and Homer have said, they're not even likely stories, they're terrible. Right? If we want to be good, we can't talk about Zeus overthrowing Kronos. We can't worship a god who has retributive justice written all over his history. Not if we're going to be pious people, and that means that we don't prosecute our own fathers. Like the Euthyphro's all about the problem of the retributive justice in the genealogy of the gods, and how in the world would we ever learn how to be faithful to our own when the gods are our examples. Now, Plato says about things like the world as it is, the realm of becoming. In Timaeus, he says something like, we might only have likely stories. But he doesn't settle on the stories that Hesiod tells. He says we need likelier stories. We need somehow better mythoi, better myths. So I want you to hear that, first of all, that myth is a word for word, and it doesn't necessarily mean that something's untrue or false. It just means it's a kind of word that once you start saying, but there are other kinds of words too, and they're not the same as myths, they're really not, then its character starts to show up. Like, oh yeah, that's a kind of story that maybe I interpret it by thinking Eros is a generative power at the beginning of all things, instead of thinking a god named Eros was present without explanation in the beginning. And I start, maybe that way I engage a myth, or maybe I engage a myth by thinking this story of the lordship of deliverers points to something better than Zeus's power to deliver, because his deliverance is always self-interested. Maybe I start to think the myth points to something that's true, but maybe not in the story that it's telling. Anyway, so you've got myth and logos in contest once you hit Plato. And the last thing I want to say is it wasn't news to the witnesses of the kingdom of Jesus that there were stories told in the Hellenistic world that resembled the stories that in fact they said are true. So the ways, if any of you were noticing moments where you're like, oh wait, this is weirdly like the Judeo-Christian story, and I don't know what to do with that, right? I'm sorry, the transgression against the ruling god, the stealing of something that belongs to the gods, and then women and men, and blah, 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 the demise of the fall of the golden age. There are ways that even the in the beginning can start to sound sometimes like it has resemblance. It has tons of divergence, obviously, from the Judeo-Christian story, but those moments of resemblance might seem strange. Well, if you can remember, Paul in Athens acknowledges right away to the people, to the Greeks, when he says, here you have a statue to an unknown god. And he says, you've been worshiping the God that I'm going to preach to you. Now, you have to know him, but I'm going to concede to you that you have in hints and guesses some access to what is true. I don't think Paul's at all saying it's saving. I don't think it's sufficient, but he finds a bridge. And the little piece that I wanted to tell you about, which was my happy discovery just this time around, another tiny bridge that I think Paul is using from Hesiod, has to do with back when Gaia is waiting for Kronos to deliver her from Urnos. She's got all her babies in her. And what Hesiod says is, she's groaning in pain, for she needs to be delivered of these children. And so the word was sufficiently familiar to me that I was like, oh, that's weird, I wonder if. And I went to Romans 8, and this is a little bridge. So in Romans 8, Paul starts saying, hey, I think that the sufferings of this present time aren't worth comparing with the glory that's to be revealed. The whole creation, he starts saying, the gospel, somehow the creation knows it and is waiting, eagerly, longing for the revelation of the sons of God. The sons of God do not yet appear as they are, right? Because we're still waiting for the glory that is yet to be revealed. And so Paul goes on to say that the earth is subjected to futility, the creation is subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that it would be set free from the bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the sons of God. And then not only the creation, but we ourselves sorry, I missed the verse. That's the cool verse here. For the whole creation, we know, has been groaning as if in labor until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit. So you're getting a lot of generative language here, and the longing for the revelation of the children of God. We too groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for the redemption of our bodies, our adoption as sons. Anyway, that's a little bit of an injustice to Romans 8. But turns out, yes, stenakidzo is the word that Paul uses. This is one of its earliest literary uses ever. And I think it maps on pretty directly to the images that are all muddled in the Gaia story, because everyone there, sons and fathers, are unwilling and oppositional, and the freedom that might come is insufficient by far. And then in the Christian story, though, here we have the longing for the revelation of the sons of God, a willing son to a good father, and the eager expectation and the waiting. And so it feels like what Paul is saying, to the extent that he is accounting for Hesiod's myth here, he's saying, yes, there is a groaning in Gaia. There is, but you misunderstood it, sort of. And I think I know what it is. I think I know what this longing and groaning is. In fact, I'm going to proclaim it to you. It's a longing for the redemption that comes when the Son, the faithful servant, deliverer, Lord, and King, accomplishes our redemption and brings us to glory. This is not to say, because I don't think that Hesiod's preaching any of the gospel, but it is to say that Paul hears, even in Hesiod, a longing for the gospel. And I think he bears witness to the ways that, in fact, Christ does truly answer our deep, dismal misery and sin. All right, so there you go. That's the end of that.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.